What's up, guys? Foxwolf here, and today, getting out of the shower, that doesn't bother me to talk about the Mr. Gloat podcast, ladies and gentlemen. Today, guys, it's a special episode, ladies and gentlemen, for me to talk about because technically no one has ever done a video like this before, actually, in a long time. Because when's the last time someone ever made a podcast while wrapped around in a towel after getting out of the shower? Well, technically, it's the first time for everyone, so it's probably best for me to do it first before other people do it. But to be honest, guys, ladies and gentlemen, ever since my last podcast, I did promise to do this earlier, but I decided to do it some other time. But that doesn't mean that we are talking about today, ladies and gentlemen. We are going to talk about the top 5 greatest world champions from New England. Now, guys, when I say New England, I'm not talking about Massachusetts. The New England territory is the northeast of the United States. There's a bunch of areas from central, southwest, southeast, northeast. There's a lot of areas from north to south, east to west of the United States. Keep that in mind. So you can look at a huge map of every single area that's taken over for the United States, and it's so different as it is. And the northeast of the United States, when it comes to Vermont, New Hampshire, Maine, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and Connecticut, those 6 territories is what it's all about. Now, you can say that New York and New Jersey and such can be counted for, depending on who you even think if those states should count, because even some people today are saying that New York does not count as being a legit area of New England. To be honest, like, there's some in Northeast, but because I won't include that because they don't want to count it, so, which I wish it did count, but yeah, it is what it is. The 6 states of the United States, when it comes to the New England, is one of those most prized possessions of champions around the world. But when it comes to the New England territory, back in those days, were pretty different for what they are. And considering it being a real interesting site for a lot of us to talk about, it's time to talk about it right now, ladies and gentlemen. So, guys, there's a lot of champions out there, but to be honest, if I did a top 10 list like I did the last time I did talk about the top 10 undefeated heavyweight champions, or heavyweight boxers for that matter, this would be a long video. So this might be a 40-minute to a 1-hour video for me to talk about. So with that being said, let's talk about it, ladies and gentlemen, right now. My number 5 pick, ladies and gentlemen, might be really shocking to you people, and it is going to be surprising. I am going to review my top 5 pick. My number 5 pick, ladies and gentlemen, is going to be a surprising one. Number 5. The number 5, ladies and gentlemen, has to be the first ever world champion. Born in Roxbury, Massachusetts, living in Massachusetts, a 5'11.5" tall guy known as the Boston Strong Boy. A guy with a 74-inch reach advantage at 5'11.5" inches tall. A guy that could weigh over 200 pounds easily. He was one of the real heavyweights back in the day. Even though heavyweight boxing back in the day, weight classes were different. His name is John L. Sullivan. Now, guys, like I said before, guys, heavyweight boxing used to be 160 pounds plus in 1738 by a guy named Broughton's Rules, named John Jack Broughton, an English bare knuckle fighter, which back in those days, boxing was bare knuckle. And in the 1880s, it still was. But by the time of the 1880s, John L. Sullivan was involved in bare knuckle until 12-ounce, several-ounce gloves were a fact in boxing. Now, guys, 100. Now, the established of the heavyweight division, ladies and gentlemen, that the official at 12 stone, which was 168 pounds at the time, in 1909, the National Sports Club already of London at the time already got through that to be 168. But then when the NSC of that time, in 1920, 11 years later, Walker Law, due to the New York State law regulator at the time of boxing, which is still something today, was at 190 pounds. So 190 pounds over was the weight you could be in. And Rocky Marciano at the time was perfect for the weight. Now, guys, of course, I completely forgot about this, but in 1979, when that time came, when they finally got boxing underway, 200 pounds plus would actually be the weight in 2003, during a time when I think we already know about Roy Jones Jr., when he became heavyweight champion, when they decided to go 200 pounds. But of course, 17 years later, in 2020, the Bridgerweight weight division came and they screwed that up. So what does this have to do with anything? Well, technically nothing, because John L. Sullivan at the time was the real boxer at the time. Now, guys, the reason I put John L. Sullivan at number 5 in this list is because back in the old days, ladies and gentlemen, boxing used to be taken into bar fights, or fights used to be outside of street corners, like bare knuckles outside, and sometimes they would actually fight in the woods. So in 1879, John O'Sullivan came out there, had his first boxing match against a guy named Jack Curley. He went into an unknown fight in a late night show that began on March the 13th, when he went into the early morning hours of the 14th, and took place between 1 and 2 a.m. when Sullivan won his first ever fight to finish. Likely, they stated it was in LPR rules with gloves. So they had gloves at the time. So count this as a professional boxing fight with bare knuckle or something at the time. And the prize money was $250 back then. And the fight was 1 hour and 14 minutes. But we don't know how many rounds were. And back in those days, guys, professional boxing matches didn't have a round basis as it did in the early fights of UFC in 93 to 95 or 96 and so on. Back then is whoever actually knocks out their opponent to stand strong at the end is the winner. And if a fight does go the distance, which I will get to another boxer later, the fight would go like, if they did have a 20-round basis or a 40-round fight, because back in those days were the most rounds you can perform in, the most rounds you can fight were 110 rounds, which was the world's record for one boxing fight, where two guys got so bloody and they managed to leave the ring to tell the tale after their injuries. And the fight ended in a draw. Ridiculous. So, yeah, back in those days, it was just knockout or just a draw. And back then, during the 1900s, newspaper decisions would be on newspaper, meaning that fights would end by a newspaper decision, meaning you can lose a fight by newspaper. And a guy named Gene Tunney would lose his first and only fight because of it, even though the fight would have been a draw. So, yeah, take that for what you will. Anyway, during this part of 1879, John O'Sullivan left the theater, Garden Theater in Boston, and Terrace, and a day later, after that, he went to take on a guy named John Cocky Woods in a place called Hanover Street in Alhambra, Boston, where the fight was benefited in 1870, when they say that the Woods was already being described as an old prize fighter. Whatever that means. But John O'Sullivan went on to fight as best he could. He took himself a full year and started just doing bare knuckles at his time. He stated that he can beat and take on any son of a bee that he can fight. He was an unstoppable foe. So in the 1880s, he went on to fight his way through competition. But in professional boxing at the time, he was just fighting against a bunch of guys that were in their debuts or none. In 1882, ladies and gentlemen, he took on a guy named Jimmy Elliott in Brooklyn, where Elliott was the former claimant to the heavyweight championship of America at the time. But around that same year, at the same time, ladies and gentlemen, John L. Sullivan took on another guy that was in the boxing world that struck gold like no one ever did. He took on a really good, tough foe, ladies and gentlemen, at the time, and no one ever thought he was a tough dude. Whatever you say about him, he went into 1882 and took on a tough win. He went into that fight after defeating James Elliott in a 4-round fight, whatever you like to say. As in 1882, ladies and gentlemen, his win against Paddy Ryan in February the 7th, when he won the American bare knuckle heavyweight champion in the 9th round after the London prize fighter in Mississippi, which had an author, an outlaw, going to that same venue, and a preacher. They had a famous preacher, an author, and an outlaw on February the 7th, went to Mississippi to watch the top fight of John L. Sullivan defeating Paddy Ryan. But that wasn't it. He continued boxing his way through bigger fights, because then in 1885, he fought against a guy named Dominic McCaffrey. And when looking at the guy's resume, his record was lousy. His record was 7 wins, 2 losses, and 3 draws. And it stated that the bout, considered this was for the inaugural lineal weight heavyweight championship of boxing at the time, and John L. Sullivan was a Boston dude. Being the first ever professional heavyweight champion from the New England states is pretty damn good. And now we're in 2025, where it's like we're 130 years into the future as this moment happened on August the 29th, 1885. It makes you wonder, what happened to the New England territory? Why are we struggling? All we know is John L. Sullivan went on to fight his way through 6 rounds, or so he thought, until it stated that they gave someone an extra round in the fight. And it's actually hilarious, because they owed a mistake of the 7th round accidentally with hard gloves. And the referee declared that Sullivan was the winner by 7 rounds by decision, where it stated that they consumed the fight of 26 minutes and 20 seconds, meaning that the fight was not 3 minutes of every round. For instance, like 4 of the rounds were 3 minutes and 3 minutes each. 1 round was 3 minutes and 15 seconds. 1 round was 1 minute and 45 seconds, and one of them was 6 minutes were lost between rounds. So technically, it's just hilarious to know what boxing was back then, when a timer limit, when you didn't have a timer and you don't know how long the match was. So yeah, at this moment, guys, John L. Sullivan would box part-time because of this. And by 1886, he fought a couple interesting fights here or there against interesting guys like Frank Herald, which was a great win for him. He had a great match against Paddy Ryan in 1886 as well, during Paddy Ryan's debut. 1887, he had a random fight that was in a split decision. But the real story took place, ladies and gentlemen, in 1889, when Jake Kilrain and John L. became the final 2 guys to ever fight for a bare knuckle heavyweight title. They fought 75 rounds in a place called Richburg, Mississippi, USA. There is some photographs that were there at the time, and this was before the Thomas Edison inventing the video camera and such. So there were pictures at the time, but not a lot. They were actually the only photographs of an actual bare knuckle match, and they're out there online today. They went 75 rounds until John L. Sullivan defeated Jake Kilrain, and Kilrain survived, luckily. Surprisingly, guys, the real story came where life would come horrible, because there was a time that John L. Sullivan was arrested by police due to a cheated illegal prize fight or something. And at this moment, John L. Sullivan had, as they stated that he's had 50 professional fights in his career, and a lot of the fights were in some of the fights were draws and no contest wins and such, so who knows? But there is something you viewers might be surprised to even look at. I found information, ladies and gentlemen, on a book that stated that John L. Sullivan in 1892, when James J. Corbett was the next person to fight, when bare knuckle boxing was dead, because July the 8th, 1889 was the final time you ever see bare knuckle boxing again, until 2018 when it was legit, when it was a legit major in America in 2018. So technically, it was pretty tough for what it was at the time. But here's the information people might not know about the night due to that fight in the Olympic Club in New Orleans in Louisiana at the time. It stated that John L. Sullivan wasn't in the best shape, and one critic stated that he was trained for a pie-eating contest instead of a fight. And guys, James J. Corbett, as some critics stated, is that Corbett... So guys, picture Corbett is the Devin Haney in Times Square a few months ago. James J. Corbett ran for 21 rounds to tire out John L. Sullivan. He tired him out for over 21 rounds, dancing, doing similar things like Devin Haney did in Times Square a few months ago. It was ridiculous. So ridiculous. Yeah, 21 rounds. Like I said before, guys, 21 rounds is ridiculous. But here's the information that makes it so shocking. So I actually copied these pages on a book in the library that stated on September the 7th, 1892. It stated right here, ladies and gentlemen, that at the time, they stated that because it was the important date of all history for the first glove contest under Queensberry rules at the time, it even stated that everyone was expecting Sullivan to win. They thought he had the chance. And it stated that John O. Sullivan was 210 pounds and he was burdened by excessive flab and was wearing himself out with whiskey and a woman. In fact, it stated that the evidence stated that before the fight, it was solid that he actually was out with a woman the night before the fight with Corbett. So you can tell that John O. Sullivan was that type of a person with excessive alcohol and drugs. So you can tell. But considering that John O. Sullivan went 21 rounds in that fight, depending how his weight was at the time, and back in the other days during the 1930s and 1980s, there were such thing as 15-round fights. 15 rounds was the most until the 1980s. We changed it to 12-round fights. That's still surprising for how John O. Sullivan can hold it off. But yeah, James J. Corbett was better than him and younger, and he was more fixed. He was in the better shape of his life. John O. Sullivan would live the rest of his life until 1918, before the end of the war, and it stated that according to the county where Sullivan died, it stated that he had an estimate worth of $3,675. It even stated that the neighborhood of Boston stated that he died with only $10 in his pocket. He was a poor man. Believe me, guys, that was the equivalent of $200 in today's money. So, yeah, back in those days, he died penniless. It also stated, a rumor stated that one of the graves or something exploded or something. I can't find the information because he died of a heart disease. But because of everything going on in life, like I said before, John L. Sullivan was that guy that he wasn't really my favorite because he wasn't taking on a lot of competition. But back in those days, he did made boxing big. And from 1882, when he was the bare knuckle champion, to 1892, that's something to talk about. So you guys got to give him credit for trying to bring boxing to the biggest. And that's what he did. He brought boxing to the height. And that's respect. Number 4. Number 4, ladies and gentlemen, is one boxer I'm not going to talk about very much. This guy had a record of 229 wins, 65 knockouts, and even with only 11 losses, 6 of them by knockout and a draw, and probably technically he had over 241 fights, and with 28.38% of knockouts, this guy became the top contender in Connecticut. Born in Midtown, Connecticut, until he died at the age of 84 in November 23rd, 2006, this guy would be the class 1990 Hall of Fame in boxing. And guys, I will talk about another fighter that had a big record at his time. This guy became big. This guy became a featherweight champion without no problem. This guy was the champion of the decade. But the problem was his resume did have early problems. This guy's resume is similar than Sugar Ray Robinson, only having over 100 wins and only 1 loss in his career. This guy had an undefeated record of 62 professional fights. He became champion and took on other fighters in his territory, which would also become New England champions. And with a record of 134 wins, 1 loss, and 1 draw this time before he suffered another loss during his time, and then he would lose other fights in the 50s. And even though he wouldn't make a lot of success in the 50s, except having to just fight part-time until he left during the late 50s and then came back in the mid-60s, but he got stuff done, winning fights, but not getting nothing done. This guy was the Ring Hall of Fame of 63 when he was elected. His name is Willie Pep. Will O' the Wisp, Willie Pep, became one of the top contenders. A guy that was known as Guglielmo Papalio, a guy that was known as his birth name at the time. This guy became a huge, murderous fighter during his time. With over 229 wins, back then, boxing was legit. Now, guys, this was during the time before Rocky Marciano came into boxing. And even though people say, oh, was he going to make his golden 50 after his win against Archie Moore? Well, to be honest, guys, winning 50 professional fights back then were nothing much special to talk about. Even today, right now, I don't think it matters if you make 50 wins. And I don't care if Terrence Crawford fights 9 more times, because at the end of the day, I don't think 50 wins even cares that much anymore if you're an undefeated fighter, retiring undefeated for that matter, because at the end of the day, we've seen a lot of fighters that won 50 fights in their career. A guy named Moonstreet, that was a minimum weight champion, that he lost his first fight in 2021, or the time when Julio Cesar Chavez went over 90 professional fights until he suffered his first loss. So it didn't matter. But this guy went on to win multiple fights. From July the 25th, 1940, before the war in America happened, this guy fought a bunch of nobody fights from his territory. And even though he was fighting in places like New Britain, Waterbury, Hartford, or even Holyoke, these were areas that he boxed in his whole time before the war. And before the war started, his first 41 professional fights were demolished wins. After July of 1942, when he defeated Abe Denner to win the USA New England Featherweight Champion in his 44th professional win, after 2 years in his debut, 44 professional fights in 2 years. And by the end of the year, he went on to win again. And in August, he had 3 more fights. You can fight every single day of a week. That's how boxing was back then. But of course, by September the 22nd, 1942, when he scored his 50th win against an Italian fighter, a longtime journeyman fighter, he continued to go straight into the boxing as he did. But then in November the 20th, 4 fights later, in his 54th professional fight, he took on Chalky Wright. One of the top contenders at the time, was a great fighter in his day, and he was amazing. He was a true fighter in boxing. And to be honest, a boxer that was fighting this deadly was amazing. He went 15 rounds against the guy from California, and this African was a great fighter in his day. And 1942 was the year that went on. He went on to win more fights until March the 19th, 1943, he lost against a guy named Sammy Angut. The fight went 10 rounds of unanimous decision in Madison Square Garden, but it was a non-title fight, but the fight was close. He was close. But this was during the time when Willie Pep took on guys like Sal Bartolo, Jackie Wilson, Harold Snooks Lacey. During the 40s, he was that dangerous of a fighter. He had fights against guys like Manuel Ortiz, Willie Joyce. He fought Chalky Wright a few more times. He was dangerous. Like, Willie Pep was an unstoppable foe. And his first draw and his only draw happened in December 1945 against Jimmy McAllister, which was his only draw. But everything else in his time. But when he was the NYCAC champion, he fought against Sal Bartolo's NBA to become undisputed featherweight champion in 1946. He even defeated great guys like Jackie Graves, Walter Colby, Dole Rafferty, like some wonderful boxers. Humberto Sierra, Jacques Huesley. These were great boxers back in the day that a lot of you people might not know much about. Humberto Sierra was one interesting fighter in his time. And when defeating guys like Patty DeMarco in 48 was a great fight, his real test came when he took on Sandy Sadler in 1948. And when he lost against Sadler by a 4-round KO in Madison Square Garden, and then had a couple nobody fights that year, fought in February to have a rematch against Sandy Sadler, only to win back that belt in 1949, which made him a 2-time featherweight champion. And that fight with their rematch in Madison Square Garden became the 1949 Fight of the Year by Ring Magazine. So you can tell that Willie Pep was that dangerous of a fighter. And his wins in 49 with great fighters were big enough to say he was good. His win against Ray Femchon in 1950 was his big good win that was a big 5-star classic. But sadly, his rematch loss in September of 1950 against Sandy Sadler was the icing on the coffin. After 8 rounds of boxing, when even though all 3 of the judges were favoring Willie Pep after 8 rounds, because there were no technical decisions back then, after that, Willie Pep suffered a shoulder injury in 7th round. By the 8th round or so, when he separated his shoulder, even though the scorecards were close because they all favored Willie Pep by a wide margin, the trilogy fight with him and Sandy Sadler ended badly. It is what it is, but this was the moment when Willie Pep tried to come back and take some time off, have a few fights a year. But he had multiple fights in 1951 after that loss, and after having interesting contender fights against Carlos Chavez, Eddie Chavez, Corky Gonzalez. He had a rematch 4th fight with Sandy Sadler in September, which was another close fight, which ended by a cornerman retirement in round 9 again. Yeah, after 2 of the guys were falling through the canvas several times in an ugly fight, which was crazy enough. But it also stated that fight was the December 1997 issue of the fight being named the 6th dirtiest fight of all time, which was bad enough. And even though the fight was so dirty, it actually caused Willie Pep's career to fall down badly for the next decade of his life because of that. He lost against guys like Tommy Collins, but he still won great fights against guys like Armand Savoy, Fabella Chavez, and Jackie Blair. He was still winning multiple fights every year and only losing 1 fight a year. And even though his loss against Gil Kadili wasn't much, he got a rematch and other stuff, but The real story came when he even fought against a contender at the time was world champion. Now, to be honest, guys, I will say this, though. Tommy Gibbons, a guy from Massachusetts at the time, a guy that some people don't want to talk about because he was a murdered, I don't want to get into the controversies of that person. The guy known for, let's not talk about the time when he was shot to death due to a Roxbury bar at the time in 1974, but still, that's not the point. But still, ever since Willie Pep couldn't defeat that top contender as a journeyman, but then he did have interesting fights against some guys. In 1958, he did fight against a guy named Hogan Kid Bassey from Nigeria, which at the time he was the featherweight champion in 1957 until he lost against Davey Moore in 1959. Surprisingly, after 9 rounds, when Pep was knocked down and lost after the end of round 9 before the final round, the scorecards had 2 of the judges favoring Willie Pep and favoring him that he was going to win. So it seemed like he was going to make a comeback. But then several months later, after his loss against Sonny Leon, he never fought again. He came back in 65 to fight 9 more big fights to win that year. And then in March of 66, he lost against a nobody, and that was it. I will say, though, he wasn't much of a bum fighter. He did prove himself as a great fighter. And even though Sal Bartolo and Sandy Sadler were other fighters from New England that were champions, but none were like Willie Pep. He was a great fighter. But there's one guy that, in my opinion, was better than him. Number 3. The Brockton blockbuster, Rocky Marciano, or Rocky Francis Marchigiano. A guy that was an Italian immigrant, as his family were Italian immigrants, but he was born in Massachusetts at the time. So he was known as, I would say, as the Italian White Hope, as you would call him. As for John Ruiz, another guy that was a great fighter, but not that great. A guy born in Massachusetts as well and became champion from heavyweight. He was his family was part of the American. Well, they said that he was that Ruiz is of a Puerto Rican descent and a first Latino boxer world champion. But people called him the Latino White Hope. In 1950, people would call Rocky Marciano the Italian White Hope. And both of these two guys were in common because they were both born in Massachusetts. So that's crazy. Now, guys, I do want to talk about Rocky Marciano's career some other time in the future, so I want to skip through this one. But his career in boxing was different. After having a failure career in amateur boxing, he would set on trying to win a fight in March of 47 in Massachusetts until he moved to Rhode Island a year and a half later. He was trying to pursue his career as a baseball player, but after that became a failure, they set him back to boxing, and he went back to amateur boxing, signed into the Rhode Island Auditorium, when he would have over a bunch of fights, but there's no footages of them, so stinks. And by July of 48, his second pro fight came, and he did something great. He defeated a couple undefeated guys in August, which would later become bummed fighters to be no more than just guys, or as one person said, was Eddie Ross was a Canadian guy with a patchy record, then would have been just no more than just a setup for Rocky Marciano, which, back in those days, it was corrupted. Keep this in mind, guys. Boxing back then was mobbed with mobsters and mafia members at the time. And even though the movie and other films of Rocky Marciano did talk about him being with mobsters at the time, but after having a bunch of big knockout fights in his career, but even though his first decision came against guys like Don McGuard back in May of 49, and his win against Ted Lowry in October by decision, his other wins at the time would be big. In December of 1949, he took on Pat Richards in his debut in Madison Square Garden. He left Madison Square Garden, went back to Rhode Island Auditorium on December the 19th, fought another guy, and then 11 days later on December the 30th, he went back to Madison Square Garden that same month against Carmine Vingo. So, yeah, and even though there was not a lot of footage about that fight, people did say there was footages of it, but archive footages might be stored in warehouses, so we don't know where these footages are. But all I can say is, when the fight ended due to injuries, and back in those days, ambulances and hospitals at the time were a lot hard to find people in ambulances to stretcher people out, they had to go to a nearby hospital several blocks away. That's how crazy it is. It did state that when Vingo was lapsed in a coma in a hospital at the time, reporter stated that Marciano was pacing up and down the corridors of the hospital, praying to God to spare his opponent's life. And even though Vingo pulled out and survived, and by early February of 1950, he would be discharged in the hospital and recover, but he would be paralyzed on one side of his body, never boxed again. But Vingo did win to see Marciano on March the 24th in Madison Square Garden to try to push him, needle him to fight against undefeated 37-0 Roland Lastarza. The fight was tough, and there were critics that believed that he did not want to pull out an injury against Roland Lastarza. By the way, back in those days, people thought that Carmine Vingo was undefeated. His record before Marciano was 16-1. Back in those days, records were that hard to understand how many fights you've lost, unless if you find archive footages or even informations of those fights. So, yeah, there's a lot of unknown fights out there that we don't know to this day. We don't even know how many fights John L. Sullivan fought in his life. But yeah, after the Lastarza fight, Marciano fought a few fights every month at the time, had fights against Gino Bovino, Ted Lowry again in November, another decision. But then in 1951 was hard. He fought against a jobber named Willis Applegate, a baseball player, and there were a lot of people that were like, how did Marciano go 10 rounds of distance with that dude? But 3 months later, after his win against Lex Lane in July, they ordered a fight against him and Joe Louis. He fought a fight in August and then defeated Joe Louis for the top to become champion. Unfortunately, Rocky Marciano, after his fight against Lee Salvad, they thought that he wasn't in the best shape at the time, so they brought him back to Rhode Island, had a couple nobody fights, fought against Harry Matthews in July that year. And then after that knockout win for the title eliminator, he fought against Jersey Joe Walcott, got knocked down, but came back, and after round 13, he scored the biggest win of his career and became heavyweight champion. He had a rematch in May against Walcott, and Walcott decided to just say, that's enough boxing for me. He had a rematch against Lastarza that same year. He had 2 fights against Cesar Charles by decision, and then there was a moment when he got cut between the middle nose, and there were moments that people said that due to the severe cut, they were trying to tell him to fight or else, because Marciano was in danger of being stopped of that fight until round 8. He defeated Cesar Charles for the 1954 Fight of the Year. In 1955, he took on Don Cocco as a British fighter. Tough dude, but not much to go the distance. And then Archie Moore, the Mongoose, would be his last fight. That guy knocked out Marciano for a second time, but it wasn't enough. Marciano and the other stuff about the Ali thing in 69, everything else, blah, blah, there was nothing to it, but I think at the end of the day, there's nothing much to talk about Marciano because I want to save him for another time. But since his passing in 1969, one day before his 46th birthday? 46? He died 45. Yeah, one day before his 46th birthday, you can tell that he was a guy that knew how to be careful with money and mobsters. And if it was time to get out of boxing due to his injury in 56, then it was a smart thing for him. 8 years in boxing, He is the Brockton blockbuster. Period. He's the best. All right, so after 40 minutes of this podcast, let's get to number 2. Ladies and gentlemen, this boxer right here, in my opinion, has to be one of the greatest Canadian fighters. And even though he moved to Massachusetts in 1887, 1 year before after his debut in 86, this guy known as Little Chocolate, a 5'3" guy from featherweight, made history as a person that a lot of people might not know about. This guy might be the most forgotten boxer in history. And it really pisses me off when you actually look at from who he is. This guy known as Little Chocolate, with a record of 65 wins and 36 knockouts and 57 draws. Yeah, remember when I said back in the day fights could end in draws or go in the distance because there weren't no judge scorecards back in the 1880s or something, or 90s? Yeah, a lot of that happened. But there were fights that ended in decision, and this guy had 30 losses in his career, 6 of them by knockout. His name is Little Chocolate, a.k.a. George Dixon. George Dixon was this small dude that came out of nowhere. He fought in Halifax in Nova Scotia, Canada in 1886 at the age of 16 years old. He moved to America to go to Boston, and he became an American citizen in Massachusetts since his death. Not too long. At 17 years old, he boxed his way through competition, but surprisingly, he fought not a lot of competitors in his time. And even though he suffered his first professional loss in June of 1889, which was a disqualification, so take that for what you will, 9 wins, 7 draws, and that was it. Can't say much about it. But his career became changeable. He actually boxed multiple rounds, from 15 rounds. He even boxed 26 rounds. And he boxed guys in their rematches, which went the distance and fought a bunch of draws. But guys, after his first loss, 1890 would be the year he fought big. He fought against a guy named Cal McCarthy, a 9-0-2 fighter, and went 70 rounds the distance for the American featherweight title. Dixon claimed the world featherweight a couple months ago against someone, but not much of a champion at 115. But then, in 70 rounds, and even though the fight was a draw, he fought another guy a few months later in October 1890. This 20-year-old 5'3" kid went 40 rounds by a KO victory against Johnny Murphy for the 114-pound World Featherweight Championship. That is amazing. And it just gets better because the next year in 1891, he gets a rematch with Cal McCarthy again and goes 22 rounds by a knockout, 6 rounds by paper decision against a 6-0-1 undefeated fighter a month later. And then in July the 28th, he fought against a guy named Abe Willis, an 8-1-12 fighter. And he knocked him out at the 5th round by KO to win the World Bantamweight Champion. George the Little Chocolate Dixon became the first fighter to become a 2 weight class champion. And he did that while being in New England. And the thing is, he actually defeated Abe Willis in San Francisco, which even makes it more amazing that he fights in other locations, to Chicago, to Troy. He even went to the UK at one point in June of 1890 for one of the fights. So he was that amazing. 2 weight class champion in over a year. And he was in boxing for only 5 years at his time. He boxed his way, winning multiple fights, but there were fights that ended in no contests. He went on to fight not a lot of great fighters at the time. There weren't a lot of great fighters. He did lose against a guy named Billy Plimmer in Madison Square Garden, but it was a 4-round fight for some reason, and it was a decision. He did had interesting title fights against Solly Smith a month later in September and won. And he did took on a guy named Torpedo Billy Murphy and guys like Young Griffo, guys that were longtime journeyman fighters and fighters that were hard to beat but easy to go the distance by a draw. He was that good. Now, guys, remember when I said that he had 30 losses in his career? Well, guys, in 1896, Dixon had 44 wins, 2 losses, and 22 draws. So what happened to his career? Before 60 wins at the time when he lost against Frank Ernie in 1896 for the featherweight title. But then, for some reason, Frank Ernie lost against, I think Torpedo Billy Murphy fought him a couple months later, and George defeated Torpedo Billy. And before you know it, later in March, Frank Ernie had some fights. He lost against, I think it was it Torpedo Billy? I think he lost around that time in 1896. I think he did. No, he lost against, no, he was still champion at the time. Interesting. So yeah, in March of 1897, George won a rematch against Frank Ernie. He lost against Sully Smith that same year in 1897, lost against guys like Ben Jordan. But did that stop him from being a champion? No, he didn't. He continued in 1899, before the end of the decade, and defeated Young Pluto, the guy that defeated, well, Dave Sullivan was another champion at the time that defeated the former champion at the time. So in 1898, I think, is when George Dixon defeated him by disqualification. Had some title defenses against Oscar Gardner, Young Pluto, and he defended the title in 1899. He defended it once in 98. In 1899, he defended the title. Wow, he defended the title 9 straight times, and 8 of those title defenses were in 1889. He held on to the title until January the 9th, 1900, when he lost against Terry McGovern. And this, ladies and gentlemen, is when his boxing career went downhill suddenly. Because after this, guys, by the end of the 19th century, George Dixon was 29 years old and with 61 wins and 6 losses and 27 draws. He would lose 24 straight fights in the next several years of his career. He lost multiple fights, and he had problems trying to recover from his career. But surprisingly, after trying to fight his way through champion and trying to make a comeback, he gets a lot of draws once in a while, but surprisingly, he couldn't get a lot of stuff done. But surprisingly, guys, there was one moment when it seemed like George Dixon did make a huge comeback, because after losing multiple fights on November the 9th, 1903, George Dixon had only 66 wins, 25 losses, and 45 draws. And he defeated a guy named Peddler Palmer, as it stated that he was billed as the 120-pound world champion. And then a month later, George defeated another person where Dixon retained his claim for the world champion. But to be honest, I tried to look it up if the featherweight was champion at the time, but I don't think it was. So it seemed like he was making a comeback, but by 1904 to 1905, he just started not winning. He just started losing and drawing fights. At the time, by 1906, in December, he lost his last fight against someone. Yeah, not good. Sadly, guys, it also stated information. So, George Dixon was a bantamweight champion and a 3-time featherweight champion. And guys, there is an article that says here on BoxRec stated, one of the all-time greats. He had fast hands. He was quick on his feet like a cat. On offense, he hit like both hands, but mostly utilized a long straight left accompanied by a stiff right. Stiff right. On defense, he guarded himself well. His quickness and ducking ability made him a difficult target to strike. He was the first black fighter to capture a world title, defeating Nuke Wallace for the vacant bantamweight title on June of 1890. In London, England. At featherweight, Dixon was both the first 2-time and the first 3-time world champion. It was quite possible Dixon that fought as many as 800 fights. And with hundreds of unrecorded exhibitions in vaudeville halls. So it is interesting to say that he was the first 3-time featherweight champion and a bantamweight champion. But some critics, in my opinion, stated that he was the first ever 2-time weight class champion. And he did that while being in New England. Sadly, guys, he would pass away in 1908 on January the 6th at 37 years old, penniless. About a few years after his retirement, he was irritated. He was interred at the Mount Hope Cemetery in Boston, Massachusetts. He was inducted in the 1990 International Boxing Hall of Fame and elected Ring Boxing Hall of Fame in 1956. They call him one of the greatest all-time bantamweight fighters. But when you look at it, a lot of people, because of his career in the 1900s, the problem about it is that George Dixon, in my opinion, might be the most forgotten boxer of all time because maybe his record was bad. Because after he had over 60 wins in his career by the end of 1899, he suffered over 24 more losses in his career until it was it. 65 wins, 30 losses, 57 is not a good resume, but seeing his final years in boxing from 1900 to 1906, yeah, it was pretty tough. And I think there was not a lot of respect. And him dying penniless is bad. Guys, you have great fighters like Demetrius Andrade, Chad Dawson, battling Balatino, Joey Archibald, Jack Sharkey, Jack Delaney, Ike Weir, Elizabeth Mueller, and Joey Gamache, John Ruiz, Johnny Wilson, Callie Reese, Lou Broyard, Louis Kid Kaplan, Mike Glover, Paul Pender, and Tony DelMarco. Those are some great fighters that barely became world champion. And the problem is, it's sad that a lot of these fighters didn't get the proper respect as they should have when they were in New England. And none could be said than number one. Number one was a guy that was from Newark, New Jersey. He had a problem in his life where he was living in a neighborhood where there was one time that his mother told him to get down. And out of nowhere, there were gunshots that shot through their window. The problem was, guys, there was a riot in the streets at the time. This young kid knew too much about the outside world, and his mother wanted him to get out of New Jersey. So they moved to Brockton, Massachusetts. And there is where they found a young kid. Now, this guy did went to one professional boxing gym. And it said that he wanted to go back, where one of the people said that he wasn't ready. He didn't have what it takes. So he went to a different boxing gym. And that changed his whole life. After having only 57 amateur wins in his career with 2 losses, he was a fighter that became the 1972 New England AAU tournament at the time in the finals, where he was outpointed by a guy named Wilbur Cameron, but would go on to win the next year's tournament in the middleweight tournament and become the most outstanding fighter in 73. until he went to professional boxing in 73 that same year. He boxed a few fights a year. When I say few, probably 8 fights a year. And then in 1974, after building up more of a resume, he took on the Olympic athlete, 21-0 Sugar Ray Seales. He went 10 rounds the distance with him. And even though they had a rematch in November, which ended in a draw, he continued winning. But then after boxing in areas in the New England, he went to Spectrum, Philadelphia in January 1976 to take on Bobby Watts. The fight was controversial where J. Russell Peltz, the fighter's promoter, stated, "It might have not been the worst decision of all time, but it is one of the pretty bad ones." It stated that when Hagler was involved with the Bobby Watts fight, the scorecards read 1 a draw and 1 46-44, 48-44 favoring it. It said that Marvin Hagler was disposed of the invincibility of the Philadelphia's middleweight, and he didn't count on the ineptitude of the local judges because he put in a lot of work. But when you look at the fight due to it, the heavier jabs by Bobby Watts did become an interesting thing. It said that one of the judges at the time said that he couldn't agree more about his judging. Yeah. It was bad. Even Judge Earl Van said that he was a judge since 54, and he's never, in all those years, he's never seen a reporter to agree with him, stating that there was a lot of moments with effective blows, and that there was more effective shots and blows, which is why he gave Bobby Watts the win. But it's even worse because 2 months later, Hagler had one fight in February, went back to Spectrum to fight against, this time, Willie Monroe. Willie Monroe was this tall foot dude that was more taller than his opponent. And before you know it, this guy defeated him. And even though this fight might have been more better, when he lost his second professional fight, he did said, "From the second round, I couldn't breathe. I learned a lot from Monroe, and I'm still young." Even though Willie Monroe said I was strong, tall, slick, and quick, he couldn't figure me out. But to be honest, guys, even J. Russell, the promoter at the time, told his opponent that Monroe had the best fight of his career. Willie just had one of those nights every fighter dreams about. But to be honest, guys, considering these two fighters defeated a legend, that legend would later kick their butts. Because Willie Monroe would have a match with him again, this time in Boston, for the North American middleweight title in February 77. That guy's name that won his rematch by a round 12 TKO is Marvelous Marvin Hagler. And if it's crazy to say the least, they had a rematch again, a trilogy in August of 77. This time in Spectrum. Again, back in Spectrum. And Hagler defeated him in round 2 by a TKO. And then Hagler, yeah, you guessed it, Hagler. Hagler went on to win other big fights against Mike Colbert, Kevin Finnegan, Doug Demings, and even Sugar Ray Seales again in 79. But you know what's crazy? In November of 1979, he fought in Las Vegas against Vito Atulafumo for the WBC and WBA World Middleweight Championship. The fight was shocked because the fight ended in a split decision draw. When in reality, in my opinion, Marvin Hagler won the fight easily. Yeah. Remember when I said that people don't give respect to these fighters from New England? Yeah, Marvin Hagler would get less respect than any other person in boxing. But surprisingly, guys, later in 1980, you know what he did? He fought a fighter And then in April, he went to Cumberland County Civic Center in Portland, Maine to have a rematch against Bobby Watts. And you know what happened? Bobby Watts lost by round 2 TKO. After his first good win against Hagler a few years ago, he lost dominantly. Not good. He later went in 1980 to fight another fight a month later. And then in September the 27th, 1980, Alan Minter defeated Vito Atuafurmo for the middleweight championship. And surprisingly, instead of fighting in their backyard, Hagler went to Alan Minter's backyard at Wembley Arena that night. And he defeated him after Alan had problems due to facial damages to cuts around his eyes. And because they had a record of 12,000 attendance that night with alcohol bottles, a riot ensues. Boston sports writers, British announcers, everyone from Sports Illustrated were shocked. It also stated a rumor that one of the Boston sports writers was getting left out of the building at the time by Vito Atuafurmo when they stated that Furmo took care of one of the spectators in the audience, not even realizing that someone just witnessed history. But here's the problem, guys, because after that fight ended, it stated that when Hagler returned back to Massachusetts in America, he was presented with the key to the city before a crowd of 10,000 people at City Hall. During the ceremony, Hagler referred ruefully in the fact that he had no championship belts to wear, saying the riot in England had forced officials to cancel the presentation. So technically, the announcers never announced the winner of the fight because of the riot. Hagler was given the belts outside of a building several days later. Yeah, so technically, I think we can already tell that Hagler's career of not getting the respect he should have was bad. He went on to take on an undefeated 30-0 fighter from the country of Venezuela. That was a 6-foot-tall dude. And there's plenty of 6-foot-tall guys out there that took on Marvin Hagler, a 5'8" dude. And Hagler took care of him like nothing. Even other fighters like Vito Atuafurmo would give a rematch with Hagler in June of 1981, and he suffered a loss. Mustafa Hamsho, Caveman Lee in 82, a rematch against the Venezuelan fighter, and another fighter at the time named Tody Simpson in 83. And then in May of 1983, he fought against Wilfred Saipion for the IBF World Middleweight Championship, the inaugural belt, the 3-belt category. And then he went on to defeat Roberto Duran, a longtime fighter, in November that same year to become undisputed 3-belt champion. So Hagler at this time became the star of boxing. And after having 2 other wins against Juan Domingo and Mustafa Hamsho, again by big victories at the time, he was a star. But then in 1985, after his win against Thomas Hearns, he actually took a break in boxing for a full year. Until March of 86, he took on John Muckaby, a 25-0, all by knockout, all ranked number 1 in the governing bodies, and had the toughest fight of his career. And it was a really tough fight. Like, Hagler had to earn his victory. And this was during the time when boxing switched from 15 rounds to 12 rounds. So, yeah, he knocked him out in round 11 by KO. And considering that this was Hagler's 11th title defense, this made him the greatest pound for pound of all time. But sadly, guys, in April the 6th, 1987, another guy named Sugar Ray ended the boxing career of the greatest. Sugar Ray Leonard defeated Hagler in one of the most controversial fights of all time. But it's hard for me to say who won the fight. Someone said that Hagler had more fighting abilities. They say that, who landed the most punches, who did this, who did that. And I am going to try to make a video out of it to understand or even talk about other information in the future. But when looking back at it, I do say to myself that there were moments when I thought to myself that Hagler was robbed of the fight. It even stated that Bob Arum and his rival promoter Don King, who was just a spectator at the bout, got into a shoving match when Bob Arum prevented King from entering the ring after the fight as they were separated by security. And that man had nothing to do with this fight, Arum said. There was no way he belonged in the ring. So when you had two promoters battling each other out with a controversial fight that just take place, that even makes history more amazing. Now, of course, Sugar Ray Leonard at the time when he came out of retirement, and even though they did say that he wanted to offer a rematch, but Hagler left the United States to go somewhere else. That's a whole story for some other time, but for some reason, guys, when Hagler passed away in 2020-21, and even though this fight was named the Fight of the Year, Upset of the Year, and the fight that was later named the Upset of the Decade, yeah, it was pretty tough. But you know what's even crazy about this? Before I end this episode, guys, I like to say they had a bunch of unofficial scorecard fighters from Miami News, New York Times, Boston Times, the UK Times, Philadelphia Daily Times. A bunch of people were giving out a bunch of cards of who won the fight. And a lot of people agreed it was close. It said that the Newsday polled Ringside, say that they had 25 Ringside journalism and asked them who they thought won the fight. 12 said Hagler, 10 said Leonard, and 3 called it a draw. So that goes to show you that anyone would have won this fight. Now, of course, if Hagler did win the fight, this would have still made him big. But it was a close fight nonetheless. But because 2 of the judges had it 115 to 113, both favoring it, 1 for each other, that's fair. But when you have a guy named Jose Juan Guerrero giving it 118 to 110 for Leonard, that, I say, is 100% controversial. Yeah. So, guys, to be honest, guys, the greatest New England boxer of all time is definitely Marvin Hagler. And even though Rummy's Corner and other YouTubers did top 10 poll lists of the greatest fighter of all time, and in top 3 formats, they would say that Marvin Hagler is one of the top 3 greatest of all around the world of all time. And you look at it, this bald dude doing everything, this guy never even wanted to use boxing shoes. That's how marvelous Marvin Hagler did in his career. He was a guy that was about close from getting killed during his childhood careers. He moved into boxing and he paid the price. But he did it for a good cause and he made himself a big star. So take that for what you will. He was a great fighter, and that's all I can say about him. And that's all I have to say about this podcast. So let me know in the comments what you viewers think is the greatest fighter of all time. Let me know in the comments. With that being said, thank you for watching this podcast. And with that being said, if you have any moments of saying who you disagree with is number 1, number 2, number 3, number 4, number 5, let me know. And with that being said, Foxwolf is out for the next Mr. Gold podcast. See you later, ladies and gentlemen.